Okay, so I do get a lot of questions about fabrics. I get a lot of questions about how to select which fabrics for certain applications, which fabrics are best for this, which fabrics are best for that. I don't particularly get a lot of questions about this, but I also see a lot of people on the internet asking about a certain terminology or certain word about that they found on websites that sell fabric, which is it's kind of been an interesting thing over the last 10 years. Vendors that are selling outdoor fabrics online are really starting to communicate a lot more of the not just the specifications for how the fabric was made, but also the measurements for the fabric's performance and various things. So what I thought I'd do is make a video that's going to walk through the main types of fabrics that we use in outdoor gear, how they're made, and why you might want to use one over the other. And along the way, that's going to really hopefully clear up a few of these terminology and marketing lingo that you might find while you're shopping for fabrics. So there are essentially three main types of fabrics used in outdoor gear. We're only going to talk about two. We're going to talk about woven fabrics and laminated or composite fabrics. The third type is knitted fabrics, which are like the stretchy fabrics like spandex and Nike Dry Fit and stuff like that, which are used in some items, but I don't really know enough about them to really talk to you about them. So I'm just going to leave it to woven and laminated fabrics. So the difference, so just to make sure we know what that is, woven fabrics. This is a picture. I think this is a picture of a basket, but essentially, if you can imagine, these are yarns in a fabric. You essentially have yarns in two different directions that are woven together, really tightly. So that would be like a woven fabric. Laminated fabrics are multiple layers, multiple fabrics that could be woven fabrics, that could be like films, that could be membranes or whatever, that are essentially glued together or laminated together to make one fabric. So we'll first talk about woven fabrics. There's a lot to, this is a huge can of worms, and we're really going to narrow this down to two types of fabrics: nylon and polyester. So they're both synthetic fabrics. So what that essentially means, synthetic fabric, it's essentially plastic. It's essentially a polymer, plastic polymer that's they've turned into very fine fibers that they've then twisted into yarns, and then they've woven those yarns together to make a fabric. So, and there's 1.5 million ways along, variations of how that's done. So we're just going to talk about the high level main differences in how all those processes can be done that have the biggest impact on the final fabric and its properties. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the actual filament that makes the fiber. So this filament is the polymer. It's the actual raw material. It's the plastic that they then turn into fibers. So you have this plastic, you've got to, in order before you can turn it into fibers, you essentially have to melt it or turn it into liquid. So that can be done by melting it, or it can be done by dissolving it into a chemical. So here's three different main processes to make synthetic fibers. There's many more than this, and this is a grossly oversimplified diagram of how it's done. But essentially, you have your liquid plastic, and this first one is melted. It's then pressurized, pumped through some really fine holes. As it's going through those holes, it's being spun and converted back to a solid and stretched all at the same time. So that can be done either in this first one, it's melted plastic that's hot, it's being pumped through some small holes, cold air is being blown over it in order to solidify it again, and then it's being stretched into a very thin fiber and wound around a spool. And this one here, rather than being melted, the plastic is actually dissolved in some kind of chemical. It's then being pumped through holes, and then warm air is being blown over it as it's going through those holes and spun and stretched to basically to evaporate the solvent, turn it back into a plastic fiber, and then it's stretched and put around a spool. In this one here, same kind of deal. The plastic gets dissolved in some kind of solvent, and then it's pumped through some small holes and spun all in some kind of chemical bath that causes that plastic to come back out of solution. So as it's going through these holes, being spun, and then it has to get washed and dried, and then turn back into, and then put on a spool. So lots of different ways to take a plastic and turn it into a very, very thin fiber. So the first, and there's a lot of things to talk about in this entire process. I don't really know anything about it. And it's all important, but really the most important thing is for us in the final properties of the final fabric is going to be the actual polymer, the chemistry of the polymer or plastic that they use to do this. So we're really going to talk about nylon versus polyester. So nylon is really the first major synthetic fiber to come to market. It was developed by DuPont, and it was primarily developed to replace silk, as silk at the time was being used for parachutes, but silk was becoming scarce and therefore very expensive. So it was kind of developed to replace silk. So what they were really after was a really fine, flexible, soft fiber. Nylon is hydrophobic, however, it can absorb water. I've heard numbers anywhere from 5 to 10%. There's a helicopter flying by right now, so I apologize if you hear that. Anyways, it's hydrophobic, so it can absorb water. I've heard numbers anywhere from 5 to 10%. And the other important characteristic about nylon is that it does have some elasticity. And this is a good thing for some applications and a bad thing for others. One of the things about this ability to stretch is that when it gets wet, it does on its own stretch out. So it is elastic, so it will return back to its original form. However, while it's wet, it remains stretched out. So that means if you're using this for a tarp or a tent, as many of you probably have seen or maybe even own a nylon tarp or tent, it does sag when it gets wet. So something to keep in mind. Another really important thing about the difference about nylon is that it is stronger than polyester, and that's hovers around 15%. It probably varies upon the grade of nylon that you use and the grade of polyester that you use, but generally nylon is stronger, so it requires more tension before it breaks. Nylon also holds dye a bit, takes on dye and then holds it a bit better. So if it's something that if vibrant colors are something that you care about in your project or your product, then nylon is probably a good choice. Nylon doesn't have any natural UV resistance, which generally isn't a big deal for us, but it's just something to kind of keep in mind, I suppose. Now, polyester, also developed by DuPont, was originally developed to be a cheaper version of nylon because 60, 70 years ago, nylon was very expensive to produce. It's much cheaper to produce now, but back then it was more expensive. And polyester was developed as a cheaper alternative, at least a less expensive alternative. Older polyesters were known to be rough, or not nearly as soft as nylon, not nearly as soft and flexible as nylon. Modern polyesters, the gap has really come down a lot more. So much so that there's no problems in using polyester for clothing. It's not a rough material. But if hand feel really, really is very important to you, then maybe stick with nylon. An important thing about polyester is that it absorbs no water and it has no stretch. So these two combined really make it great for tarps and tents, because you can put some tension on those those guy lines for those tarps, and they're going to stay taut even when they're wet, unlike nylon. Polyester also has a little bit better UV resistance. Okay, so digging just a little bit deeper into nylon versus polyester. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as just saying, oh, this is a nylon fiber, or oh, this is a polyester fiber. There are different chemical makeups in nylon and polyester. Nylon is really more like nylon and polyester both are really more of like a family of chemicals. So we're going to just take nylon as an example. And there are two main types of nylon, and there probably are others. I'm not an expert. I don't really know how many there are. But there could be a lot more than this. But two common types are nylon 6 and nylon 66. And these are a lot of the fabrics that we use, at least that specify which type of nylon they're made out of, for instance. It's one of these two nylons. Nylon 66 being more expensive than nylon 6. And the reason, well, I don't know exactly why it's more expensive, but it is considered a better compound than nylon 6. And here's why. On the left here is nylon 6, on the right is nylon 66. These are chemically identical. You got the same atoms, you got carbon chains, you have oxygen and nitrogens and hydrogens, and the only difference is how they are arranged, and therefore that impacts which atoms are bonded to which atoms. So you can see that what this diagram is showing is that in nylon 6, because of the way that they're arranged or the way the atoms are aligned, there's a lot of just sort of open connect. There's a lot of atoms that are just sort of off on their own, whereas in nylon 66 you have a lot more connections. So there's a lot more connected, a lot more bonds between atoms in this structure than in this structure, and therefore it's been measured to be slightly more stable and stronger. Now we're going to come back to this a little bit. We're going to keep coming back to this point, but these brand names and marketing terms that you hear assigned to different fabrics that you see online, Cordura, Dacron, Robic, Pertex, Hyper-D, Venom, Membrane, these are just examples. There's many more than this. These could indicate many different things. Some of these, like Pertex for instance, or Cordura, is like a trademarked and patented combination of the whole manufacturing process of that fabric. Everything from the type of nylon or polyester, or basically the type of plastic that's used to make the fibers, to how those fibers are woven, or how those fibers are twisted into yarns, to how those yarns are then woven into a fabric, to how that fabric is then finished. That whole process is wrapped up into a name like Cordura. Other things you might see, like nylon 66, is just the chemical makeup of the filament that's used to make the fibers. That's it. And there could be an infinite number of ways that a fabric is made from nylon 66. Whereas Cordura has a lot more. It's a lot more descriptive. It's descriptive of an entire process for how that fabric is made. I hope that makes sense. And then some of these other ones, and so Cordura is like a actual Cordura and Pertex, for instance, are like a trademarked and patented process. Some of these other ones I don't really know a whole lot about. They may or may not just be essentially marketing terms slapped onto a fabric by either the factory that made them or the middleman that's importing them into whatever country that you live in, to the actual vendor who's selling them to you. Any of those people could just call the fabric whatever they want. But I think the main point is that, at least from a chemical perspective, is that two different nylons fabrics that may have two different brand names, they could actually be different. And it's sort of up to your own research, or really the honesty and integrity of the entire supply chain for how that fabric gets from the factory into your hands, to what these marketing names actually mean. Here's just another. This is another diagram of the process for how these fibers are made, showing there's a lot of different variables, and potentially there's a lot of different places where different temperatures and pressures and chemicals and whatnot can be varied and make very different fibers at the end of the day. Okay, so once we have our fibers, we then need to turn those fibers into yarns, because you don't weave the fibers, you weave the yarns. The fibers are too thin to weave. So the way yarns are made is they're made up of fibers that are twisted together, and there's lots of different ways that this can happen. Here's just a really simple 2-ply, 3-ply, 4-ply. So you can see like a 2-ply is just two fibers twisted together to make a yarn. 3 and 4, obviously, respective. 3 fibers, 4 fibers. There's a lot more complex ways to twist yarns together as well. So just a couple of examples. Here's one here, the lower left. You've got like 3 2-ply yarns twisted together into a 3-ply yarn. They call this a cabled yarn. Another odd one here, it's like you've got 3 fibers. You got like 1 fiber that's acting as a core, and then 2 fibers twisting around that one. So yeah, look, there's a lot of different ways that fiber can be turned into a yarn, and can result in yarns of different strengths and diameters and weights and whatnot. It's a really important point here. So this is probably a word you're going to see in almost every single description of a fabric that you buy. Hopefully you see this word, denier. What denier refers to is the weight of the final twisted yarn that's used to make that's woven together to make that fabric. So it's not describing the thickness of the fabric or the weight of the fabric. It's describing the weight of the yarn, and that's in grams per 9 kilometers. So a 10 denier yarn is 10 grams per 9 kilometers. So that yarn, a 9 kilometer length of that yarn weighs 10 grams. It's really important to know that has nothing to do with the diameter of the strength. Obviously, a heavier yarn is almost certainly going to be a thicker diameter and probably a stronger yarn. However, the number itself is a measurement of the weight, not of the diameter or the strength. So that's yarns. Once you have the yarns, they need to weave them together into a fabric. So that's the actual yarns that are woven together. Most of our fabrics that we deal with in the outdoor industry are going to be just a regular plain weave. So that's where you've got fabrics of the same denier in the up and down direction as you do in the left and right direction. There's like industry terms for the fabric, for the direction up and down and left and right. I don't know what they are, but essentially in this plain uniform weave, if you have a 20 denier fabric, it would be like 20 denier yarns going up and down and 20 denier yarns going left and right. It is possible to have different deniers in each direction. They call it like a directional plain weave, and I've seen fabrics like that before, so keep that in mind. If you're dealing with fabrics like that, just keep in mind that the fabric is probably going to be stronger in one direction than the other. Now there's thousands and thousands of different types of weaves. We're going to talk about, I don't know much about them, but we are going to talk about twills briefly, because I'm pretty sure that diamond ripstop is a variation of a twill weave, I think. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But generally, and twills are just kind of same kind of deal, up and down, left and right yarns, but rather than just like an up and down yarn going up, over and under every single other left and right yarn, you have different variations. So you can see, like, we'll follow this left to right yarn up, the second one down, so it goes under one yarn, over one, and then over three, and then under one, then over three, and then the up and down same way. It's over one, under three, over one. So, and there's infinite different combinations for how that might look. So if you kind of cross your eyes in these twill weaves, you can kind of start seeing that there is a bit of a pattern. Like on this far left one, if you cross your eyes, you'll see that there's a diagonal stripe of black. Ripstop is a type of weave, and it's essentially where in the plain weave, it's where every like 5 or 10 or 20 yarns is a heavier denier. So if you've got a plain weave that's 20 denier, and then you would have like every 10th yarn in both directions would be like 70 denier or something like that, and that would be your ripstop. So here's just a picture of that. This is the best one I can find because it shows the ripstop yarn is a different color than the regular yarns. But you can see that the ripstop yarns in white are significantly thicker than the background black yarns that they're woven in with. So that increases the strength of the fabric. It's obviously the marketing term ripstop. It also implies that it's meant to be stopping rips. I personally have found that on these really ultralight fabrics that we use, like these 30 and 20 and 10 denier ripstops, yeah, it's a bit of I obviously don't have any like data to back this up, but I don't feel like it does a whole lot to stop rips. I feel like if it rips, it just goes right through these ripstop ones, no matter what. However, definitely on the heavier fabrics, like once you get up to 3, 4, 1,000 denier, certainly the ripstop is significantly helps in stopping rips from propagate. However, I must say, I have spoken to some very knowledgeable people about this before, and some people think that while yes, ripstop can help stop rips from propagating, it's just as guilty at initiating rips. So in other words, if you're using it on a piece that's got a lot of abrasion on it, like say like a tent floor, and a stick catches and it's rubbing up and against a stick or something like that, or a rock on the ground, the thicker ripstop yarns have a tendency to snag on something, and then that's what initiates a rip in the fabric. So something to think about. I don't know if there's been a whole lot of like actual science done on that to back that up, but it's an interesting I don't know, thought, I guess. Here's another. This is a diamond weave ripstop, is that we normally call it in the industry. So this, if I zoom in on this, you can really see that. I think some people might think that in diamond weave ripstop there is actually yarns going in the diagonal direction. But that's actually not the case. You still only have yarns going in two directions, up and down, left and right. And if you zoom in, you can see that these diamond patterns are actually made up of yarns going up and down. This one here, this one here, this one here, and they're woven in such a way that gives it a diamond pattern. So that comes back to these twill weaves. It's like a special kind of twill weave that results, rather than like a herringbone pattern or a diagonal pattern like this one here, it results in a diamond pattern. And that's those yarns that are making that diamond pattern may or may not be a heavier denier than the other yarns. They almost always are heavier denier, and hopefully your vendor will specify how much heavier, but they don't necessarily always are. Just to demonstrate that, here's an example. It's actually a cotton tablecloth fabric, but I got it because it's got both the diamond weave pattern and it's got the traditional grid ripstop pattern. And in this particular case, the blue ripstop pattern, it is actually a slightly heavier denier yarn that's in blue, but the diamond weave is actually the same denier as the other fabric here. It's just woven in a way to make that diamond pattern. Before we move off of weaving, just a couple last things to say. You probably will see the term taffeta used a lot in some vendors, and taffeta is not actually a weave. It's all that is a descriptive term for a soft and silk-like fabric that's got a sheen, and so that just so happens to be exactly what a really ultra lightweight sort of 10 or less denier non-ripstop nylon or polyester looks like. So very soft. It has especially if it's calendared, it'll have a kind of a sheen to it. So they'll call that taffeta, but it's really that means nothing for the actual. It's not related to any kind of process for how the fabric is made at all. So lastly, before we move off of the weave, I just want to again come back to the term denier. So denier of the fabric is actually the denier of the yarns that make up the fabric, which is defined by the weight of the yarns. So we know that now. So, however, this does not directly correlate to the weight of the fabric. Okay, so while a 20 denier yarn is twice as heavy as a 10 denier yarn, a fabric woven from 20 denier yarns is not twice as heavy as a fabric woven from 10 denier yarns. Right? So this is because the 10 denier fabrics are thinner than the 20 denier fabrics, and therefore when you make a tight weave, there'll be more 10 denier yarns per square inch than 20 denier yarns. So a fabric made of 10 denier yarns will be lighter weight than a fabric made from 20 denier yarns. It just won't be half the weight. It'll be more like 80% of the weight, if that makes sense. Okay, moving on to finish. So now that we've got woven fabrics, we'll move on to how those fabrics may be finished prior to going out the door. I'm just going to pause right here and point out one more thing. Almost all fabrics will have a weight per square yard associated with them, and that's oftentimes how they're marketed. You might see like a 1.1 ounce ripstop nylon, or a 0.9 ounce, or a 0.7 ounce, or a 1.9 ounce, whatever. What's often not communicated is that weight before or after finishing. So a lot of people, a lot of manufacturers and vendors will not be, unfortunately, and they might not even know themselves. Obviously the manufacturer will know, but they might not know themselves if that's a finished weight or if that's a weight before finishing, which is an important distinction, because you could have a 1.1 ounce ripstop nylon at this point after it's woven, and then apply finishing to it. So you might apply like silicone to it, which will bump that up to like 1.4 ounce per square yard, but it will be marketed as a 1.1 ounce ripstop steel nylon, for instance. Just something to keep in mind. Okay, so the first finishing process we'll talk about is called calendaring. Calendaring is when the woven fabric is passed through two big steel rollers that are very highly polished and heated. Usually one is heated more than the other, and then they're put at a very specific pressure as well. So it kind of heats and squishes the fabric. So here's a picture of a fabric before, or a diagram of fabric before calendaring. So these black circles are kind of yarns that are coming in and out of the screen, and obviously the white is going parallel to the screen. And then one that's after calendaring. So you can kind of see it's been squished and flattened together, and the heat kind of, I don't know, maybe like partially melts the plastic or the yarns and makes them stay in that shape. Now this is done for a lot of reasons, like in fashion or stuff like that. It's done because it gives the fabric like a sheen, and if you put like a pattern on those rollers, you can put a pattern on the fabric and whatever. But the reason it's done with outdoor fabrics is because it decreases the porosity and permeability. So what that means is that wind is less likely to cut through the fabric, and maybe even it's certainly not anywhere near waterproof, but maybe it's less prone to having water just easily seep through it. And most importantly for us as DIYers, it's downproof. So down feathers can't get in and out. So you can see this upper one, you can see there's gaps between the yarns that wind or down can easily move in and out of. And then once it's been squashed or calendared, it becomes a lot less porous, and if you're making a down quilt or a down jacket or a down hat or anything with down, you want to make sure you're using calendared fabric so the down stays where it's meant to be. Another really common finishing that's applied to our fabrics is DWR. It stands for durable water repellent. What it is a chemical that's applied to the woven fabric that makes it that leaves a hydrophobic kind of film on there, a very thin hydrophobic film. Now, what this means, it does not make it waterproof, but what it means is that when, like, for instance, here's a perfect photo of a fabric that's been treated with DWR that's then been spritzed with water, and the water just sort of beads up like this. Now, if you were to shake that, most of that water would just sort of fly off. However, if you kind of let this water sit for a minute or two, it would start to eventually seep down into the fabric. So it's not totally waterproof. The important thing about DWR is, even though it is it's marketed as durable water repellent, and it does last a while, it does eventually wear out. So through use, your fabric's going to get is going to be subjected to abrasion, to washing, to packing in and out of your pack, to getting wet, and whatever. Eventually the chemical does sort of, lose its ability to beat up water like this, or to be hydrophobic. So what you got to do is just sort of remember that you should reapply. You can just get DWR spray at any kind of outdoor store like REI or anywhere online, and reapply it every once in a while. It depends how often you use it. For me, every year or two, I usually just get a fresh bottle of DWR treatment and just treat all of my gear in one big go. I spend a whole day, treat it all as instructed on the bottle, and that way all my stuff is kept fresh. The last finishing that we're going to talk about is waterproofing like a woven fabric, and this is done in two primary ways. So it can either be silicone impregnated or polyurethane coating. I'm not 100% sure on this, but I get the suspicion that they call it silicone impregnation because it's coated on both sides, whereas a polyurethane coating, I think they only put it on one side. I'm pretty sure that's how it works. At least most of the fabrics that I've gotten, like sil nylons that I've gotten, you can't really tell which side is which. However, if you get a polyurethane coated fabric, generally you can very clearly see which side has polyurethane on it and which side doesn't. Now, silicone is generally considered the lighter weight option of the two. What polyurethane is generally considered the more waterproof option of the two. That obviously depends on how much silicone or how much polyurethane is put on there, but generally that's the case. I'd recommend, hopefully the vendor you're buying from will list the actual measured waterproofness of the fabric, and the way that's generally the most common way that's communicated is through what's called hydrostatic head, which is a measurement that's done. They put a column of water. It's essentially, if you have a piece of fabric, it's how high of a column of water can you put on top of that fabric before it starts leaking. So if you have, for instance, like 4,000 millimeters of head, that means that 4 meters of water was put into a column on top of that fabric before it started to leak, which is quite waterproof, or it's just be more waterproof than, say, a fabric that had a hydrostatic head of 2,000 millimeters, something like that. So that's and then the other point I want to make about this finish is that make sure you know what you bought, because when you go to seam seal, you need, like most seam sealers will only work for one or the other. So make sure if you buy a silicone impregnated, it's like a sil nylon, make sure you get a seam sealer that's good for silicone. If you get a polyurethane coated fabric, make sure you get a seam sealer that will work with polyurethane. If you don't know, you do some further research, or just reach out to the vendor who's selling you the fabric or the seam sealer, and go ahead and make sure you're getting the right stuff. Okay, so that's woven fabric, and it's obviously there's a lot more to it than that, but that was what I believe is going to be the main things that you need to know in order to help you buy the right fabric for the right applications. So now moving on to the other type of fabric that we'll talk about is the non-woven fabrics, or sometimes called laminated fabrics, or sometimes called composite fabrics. And this is a infinite combination, obviously, because you can have any combination of any kind of fabrics basically glued together to make these. Now, the first one we're going to talk about is, it used to be called Cuban Fiber. And then there was a company that owned it. I think they were called like Cube 3. I don't know. There was a company, the company that owned the patent and the manufacturing of Cuban fiber sold. I don't know if the company sold was purchased or if the actual carbon fiber product was sold, but the company that makes Dyneema bought them. So now it's called Dyneema composite fabric. It was originally invented for sailing. So here's a sailing boat, and this goes to the case really with like a lot of the fabrics that we use actually were originally invented for sailing. From spinnaker cloth to carbon fiber to X-Pack, all this stuff was originally made for sailing. What is Dyneema composite fiber or carbon fiber, or Dyneema composite fabric or carbon fiber? What it is it's 3 layers, and it's essentially a layer of loosely, I don't know if it's woven or what, but it's a loose grid of Dyneema fibers, thin Dyneema fibers that are sandwiched between 2 layers of PET film, PET plastic film, or mylar. Now, PET is the exact same plastic that like disposable water bottles are made of, that you like a cheap water bottle you buy in a store. Obviously, but it's a lot thinner than those bottles. And mylar is just PET plastic that's film that's been metallicized. It's like a coating of a metallic coating on one side, essentially. Now, Dyneema, the fibers, that's really where the strength and the cost of carbon fiber comes from. Dyneema fibers are incredible. They're marketed as the strongest synthetic fibers that money can buy. I don't doubt it. I'm sure it's true. And what they are ultra high molecular weight polyethylene fibers, whatever that means. Sounds fancy. But they're very, very strong. If you're into hammocking, you probably know a bit. If you're into sailing, because again, this is another innovation that came from sailing. They make a lot of ropes and lines out of it. So it's the fabric. Now the fabric has an incredibly high tensile strength for its weight because of these fibers. Because these fibers are so strong, they can make them very, very thin. They can make the plastic that encases them extremely thin, and you get a very, very light finished fabric that's waterproof and quite strong, especially for its weight. So totally waterproof, totally windproof, and it's amazing stuff, very high end stuff. Now there are some downsides to it, and I have worked with it a little bit before. I have to admit I haven't worked with it that much, but I do own a lot of gear that's made out of carbon fiber, and so I'm not like an expert any means, but hear me out. There are some downsides to it, and those are the big one is that it's not very abrasion resistant. So you're dealing with, while the Dyneema fibers themselves are very, very strong, the plastic films do not have a whole lot of strength behind them. Really, the plastic films make it so that they're only there really to support the fibers and keep them in place, and of course to make it waterproof and windproof and whatever. But just it is a bit fragile, and it's not very like just regular carbon fiber is not, or regular Dyneema composite fabric is not the most durable when it comes to abrasion resistance. Some people are under the impression that it doesn't have great puncture resistance. In my experience, it does okay with puncture resistance. And then the other thing is that over time, at least on the carbon fiber gear I have, it forms these creases in the plastic, and these creases, I get the feeling, are create weak points where the mylar or the PET plastic film is really susceptible to especially susceptible to abrasion and punctures. The other big downside is that it's like an order of magnitude more expensive than other fabrics. So and I think that's probably the big reason why it hasn't. Well, those two reasons really are the two reasons why it hasn't really hit mainstream yet. You really only see it in people who are make DIY gear and gear from really small college manufacturers, is because it's so expensive. And then there are legitimate long-term durability concerns with it. The other thing is that neither Dyneema nor PET can take dye. So this is something just to keep in mind. It's probably why you may have noticed that the color selection in this stuff is quite limited, and even when it is colored, it's obviously not the most vibrant coloring you've ever seen in a fabric. And the other thing is that while it can be sewn or taped, which can be seen as an advantage, like if you don't particularly want to sew, it's really recommended that you have to do both on every seam, even if it's not for waterproofing. And the reason why is because when you punch a bunch of really small holes in this, like when you're sewing, there's a tendency for those holes to elongate, and they can eventually turn into points where a failure. So taping over a sewn seam really helps reinforce the seam, and then obviously keeps it waterproof as well if you need it. So I think that's really all I have to say about Cuben fiber. Again, I don't have a ton of experience in working with it. I do have some experience in using it in gear, and to be honest, it's my personal interest. It's probably something that I won't really be using a whole lot of. There is something to note that some of these weaknesses, they have been addressed, and with another variation of the stuff where they kind of laminate. They take a Dyneema composite fabric and they sort of laminate onto it something to increase its abrasion resistance. They might like laminate like a ripstop nylon or something. I actually have a backpack that's made out of that. It's Cuben fiber laminated to like a 210 denier ripstop nylon, and it's great. That is one way to address the abrasion resistance, at least of one side of it. However, it's still incredibly expensive. So there's another, so the next type of composite fabric that we'll talk about is breathable waterproof fabric, or sometimes you'll see it abbreviated as BWP. So we're talking about things like Gore-Tex and Event, etc. There are lots of different brand names, and there are also generic membranes that are sold. This is generally referring to the actual membrane. However, what you never buy just the membrane. You buy a fabric that's laminated, and the membrane is usually sandwiched between other fabrics. The reason for that is because the membranes are usually quite susceptible to tearing. They can be quite weak. So what these are, this membrane is a membrane that allows air to pass through, but not water. Or the really fancy ones will claim that they allow air and water to pass through one way and not the other way. So so essentially what they say is that is you can use it as a waterproof fabric, but it'll allow your sweat to evaporate through it. And some of it is amazing. Some of it, I've had like a nice Event. I've got a nice Event ski jacket that is incredible. It really does do that. It really is waterproof, and it really does it breathes quite well. So what you'll find is usually marketed as I recommend Seattle Fabrics is my favorite place to get this stuff from. They have different brand names. I think Ripstop by the Roll might have something as well, but they'll usually be marketed for if you can buy the fabric. You usually find it in one of three variations: a 2-layer, a 2.5 layer, and a 3-layer. I recommend either the 2.5 or the 3-layer. So the 2-layer, the yellow is the actual membrane, and then the white is the face fabric. So that'll be like usually some kind of ripstop nylon or something laminated to the membrane. And then the blue one is a backing fabric that'll be used for like against your skin, like a lining. So the 2-layer doesn't have a backing fabric, and you really need to make sure that if you get a 2-layer, you really should line it yourself. So this would be if you have a specific fabric that you want to line it with, maybe some kind of knitted fabric or some kind of taffeta, something really, soft that you want to line it with. A 2.5 layer construction has a kind of like a mesh, and this is what I like to use because it's very lightweight relative to a lot of other breathable waterproof fabrics. And then the 3-layer fabric will have an actual woven fabric, so like another another nylon or polyester lining. If you go like commercial, like big companies, Patagonia and stuff, they'll usually use more than 3 layers in their technical fabrics. And you might be able to find fabrics for sale like this, but they usually have more layers than for different functions, for strength or for added breathability or whatever, added waterproofness. But really the sky's the limit for these kind of fabrics. Lastly, another one that is another fabric that's come from sailing, X-Pac. And I think this is I love this fabric. It's really good if you need something strong, really strong, and relatively lightweight. So I use this for backpacks, for making bags for like my bike bags and stuff like that. Stuff that like is totally waterproof and very abrasion resistant and very strong fabric. So there's a lot of different variations, but generally there's 3 layers, sometimes 4, but 3 layers. There is a nylon or a woven, could be polyester or nylon face fabric, could be ripstop, could not be, whatever. And then there's a layer of polyester, very thick polyester yarns, and then another layer of PET plastic or mylar, just like carbon fiber. So the polyester yarns are sandwiched between the face fabric, which is a woven polyester or nylon, and a single layer of the PET plastic, which is for waterproofing. And then sometimes there's a 4th layer to protect that PET plastic layer, and a 4th layer of woven fabric. Now, the main differences between different X-Pac fabrics, you'll see them as like X07, X21, X42. The main difference is the denier of the yarns in the woven face fabric. All right, so they'll all have in common is the really thick polyester yarns in the X pattern, and they'll have the PET plastic film. They'll have that in common, and differences in the woven face fabric. So X07 means that they use a 70 denier fabric for that face fabric. X21 means they use a 210 denier face fabric, and an X42 means they use a 420 denier face fabric. And here's just another photo of a different variation of it. So, and this is an outstanding fabric again for anything that you really need a lot of durability on, and you don't really. I mean, it's not super heavy. I mean, it's heavy for ultralight standards, but like if you're talking about building a duffel bag, there certainly is much heavier material that you can use. But this is, for its strength, is very respectable. So, guys, that's all I really have. I hope that. I know this is coming from a complete beginner standpoint, but I hope anybody who suffers through that whole thing learns something. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to either comment down below on this or email me directly. I love getting emails from you guys. I'll do my best to get back to each and every one of you. All right. Have good luck in your next project, and hopefully you let me know how it turned out.